HTTP versions. What are they? How many versions of HTTP are there? In brief, there is HTTP 0.9, defined as the one-liner protocol. It's extremely simple. It can only do get and receive HTML files. HTTP 1 introduces HTTP verbs, status codes, headers, and the ability to send more than just HTML files. Then there's HTTP 1.1, the first standardized protocol, which adds a series of features such as connection reuse, pipelining, content negotiation, and the host header. Then we have HTTP 2, which is primarily a performance increase and built upon Google's proposed Speedy protocol. And lastly, we have the upcoming Quick protocol from HTTP 3, which provides further performance improvements. So what is HTTP 0.9? The very first HTTP 0.9 wasn't actually called that, but was later provided that name to differentiate it from other versions. It only supports the GET method and doesn't have any status codes, so you can only receive HTML as there's no headers as well. Here's an example of a HTTP 0.9 call. It's very simple, and you can only specify a single server because you're specifying the resource as part of the GET request. So what about HTTP 1? This provides many of the features we use today in HTTP. It's introduced in 1996 and adds the version information sent with each request, so we prepend with HTTP 0.9. We have the status code at the beginning of each response, and then we also have HTTP headers, which allows us to send more than just HTML. So here's an example of the request and response. It's very similar to what we see today. There's not much difference here. Now, one concern is if you receive an HTML file, how does the image with a specific source actually load up? Well, in order to do this, we actually need to establish another connection to retrieve the image. So we do the original request, and then we do another request. Is this sufficient? We will see soon. So then we do simply another request, and we receive back the image contents as the payload. Introducing HTTP 1.1. As I mentioned before, it's the first officially standardized version of HTTP. It was introduced in early 1997, and it adds connection reuse, pipelining of requests, the addition of the host header, and content negotiation. It also adds cache control mechanisms. So what do I mean by reusing connections? So recall that in the HTML page, we received the image tag which needs to load another image. In the typical short-lived connections of HTTP 1, we establish a connection, get the HTML, close the connection, establish another connection, get the image, close the connection. In HTTP 1.1, we establish a connection, and then we notice that we actually have an image, so we can use the same connection over. That's known as keep alive or persistent connection. Likewise, we can also pipeline requests if we have multiple images, we pipeline them so we don't have to wait for the round trip time. So what is the host header used for? So the host header was introduced so that you can indicate the host name and port of the requested server. So if I have a server running at a specific instance and I have two different DNS records posted pointing to the same server, then it's possible that I can actually host using only one server both websites because I know from the host header what the specific server is that I'm contacting. This provides a huge win because now I can run two sites on one server. So now what did I refer to as content negotiation? Recall that we learned about HTTP status code 300 before. Content negotiation is the mechanism applied for serving different representations of a resource at a given URL, so the user agent can specify what's best for them. So for example, language. There's two types: server-driven negotiation, where we leverage predefined HTTP headers to convey desired properties. Then the server just decides what's best. If I say English, likely I'll get an HTML page that is in English. For agent-driven negotiation, it's actually poorly defined by HTTP 1.1 standards. Typically, you get a 300 status code, which is multiple choices, and then the user would send subsequent requests to finer grain and pick out what content they need. You can pause this slide just to see the specifics of how this works. So now what did I refer to as cache control mechanism? Well, HTTP 1.1 defines the cache control header field used to specify directives for caching mechanisms in both requests and responses. It defines a series of different headers that we can use. We can specify the number of cache results, something specific to a user, or the amount of time that we want to keep it a specific resource in the cache before we need to revalidate it. So now what does HTTP 2 bring? HTTP 2 is simply a performance improvement over HTTP 1.1. It adds a series of things on top of it, including data compression, a concept known as server push, and several other improvements, which I'll cover in a later video. The key takeaway from this is that the high-level structure is the same, but changes in the way the data is framed and transported. So what about HTTP 3? HTTP 3 is the upcoming HTTP version, which uses UDP over TCP, but it is not in active use yet. Speaking of use, HTTP 2 is now the majority shareholder, and HTTP 1.1 has the rest of the requests. Thank Thank you all for watching, hope you enjoyed this video, and stay tuned for more content every Friday.